Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to another episode of Double Take. Today's Double Take is Gregory's Girl from 1980, directed by Bill Forsyth, and Some Kind of Wonderful from 1987, directed by Howard Dutch. Now, I'm talking about both these films because they're both films about teenage boys, adolescent boys, and the idea of this perfect image of a woman or a girl, and just the differences between the American view and the Scottish view. One of these films is an absolute classic, and one of these films is a bit of cheesy fun, but there's other things going on in both films. So we'll start with Some Kind of Wonderful. Again, this is directed by Howard Dutch, written by John Hughes, Pretty in Pink, and Some Kind of Wonderful, the John Hughes films, John Hughes didn't actually direct. Howard Dutch had an amazing career with Pretty in Pink, Some Kind of Wonderful. He did The Great Outdoors, Article 99 with Ray Liotta, Grumpier Old Men, the sequel to Grumpy Old Men, Odd Couple 2, the sequel to The Odd Couple, The Replacements, which is actually a fun little film about the 1987 NFL strike with Keanu Reeves, and The Whole 10 Yards, which is a sequel to the Bruce Willis mafia witness protection comedy The Whole 9 Yards. And he did a bunch of TV and a bunch of Billy Joel music videos. So let's be honest, he's not the greatest director to walk the earth. The film stars Eric Stoltz, who gives a fairly robotic performance, Leah Thompson and Mary Stuart Masterton, who was pretty big in the mid-80s. She was Sean Penn's girlfriend at Close Range. She was in Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe, if that's the right title. Leah Thompson was obviously in Back to the Future. And it's about a poor kid played by Eric Stoltz, who's a bit of an outcast, hangs about with Watts, played by Mary Stuart Masterton, who's a drummer and tomboy. You know, people have made comment that she's probably a lesbian and she's just been forced into heterosexuality. But just because she's got short hair and is a tomboy and plays drums doesn't actually make her a lesbian. I've looked it up. And it's really about Eric Stoltz and his obsession with Leah Thompson, because that's his idea of the perfect woman, and she's so beautiful and wonderful, and she comes from the rich side of town. She goes out with Craig Sheffer, who's sporting a wonderful mullet in this film, and just gives a wonderfully sleazy performance as this rich kid who has no consequences to his actions, can do whatever he likes. He calls Leah Thompson his property. You know, he's pretty much chatting up other girls while he's supposed to be going out with her. He's a complete sleazebag. But again, because he's handsome and cocky and rich, he somehow gets away with it. It's about cliques. But again, it's this image that that's what you should go after. And it's a brilliant bit of casting because, no offence to Leah Thompson, but she's perhaps not kind of the epitome of, an absolute bombshell. So if you compare this to The Sure Thing, which I don't know was written by John Hughes as well, it feels like it, which is the 80s riff on It Happened One Night with John Cusack and Daphne Zuniga. In that one, the epitome of womanhood is Nicolette Sheridan in a bikini. So in this one, Leah Thompson is built up as this amazing, beautiful target, but she's not actually, well, to me, she's not actually that stunningly, amazingly looking, but again, it's just that idea. And obviously, Mary Stuart Masterton is the one that actually loves Eric Stoltz, and Eric Stoltz can't see it. So it's fairly predictable, but it is elevated by the fact that most of the characters in the film are pretty much sociopaths. I mean, Eric Stoltz is only interested in Leah Thompson, and that's all he cares about. His dad, who's played by John Ashton, who gives a wonderful turn, who's a tyre salesman, he's put the money away for Eric Stoltz to go to college, which he then spends all the money on earrings to give to Leah Thompson. And there's a wonderful scene where John Ashton is pretty much, because he never went to college, nobody in their family's been to college, so he's just obsessed about getting Eric Stoltz to college. So obviously when he takes all the money out of the bank and spends it in earrings, he's suitably annoyed. But again, all Eric Stoltz can see is like Leah Thompson, and that's like the be all and end all. Leah Thompson just seems to be fairly empty and just lives up to the idea of, the rich girl. Craig Sheffer is a complete sociopath. But there's another performance in the film that really elevates it, and that's a really early performance by Elias Koteas, who for me is one of the most underrated actors in the cinema. I think he's credited just as Skinhead, and he clashes with Eric Stoltz and Mary Stuart Masterton early in the film. He actually asks the Watts character, "Are you actually a lesbian?" So they get put in detention. Eric Stoltz's character thinks that Leah Thompson has been put in the same detention, so he sets off a fire alarm, so he ends up in detention, but of course it's just boys, so he ends up with Elias Koteas' crew, who at first is obviously aggressive to him, but then they form a bond because they're both drawing. Eric Stoltz is drawing a picture of Leah Thompson, obviously, and Elias Koteas is carving something on the front of the desk, and they kind of compare the pictures. It's a wonderful early performance by Koteas. There's actually a similarity to his performance in Crash, that kind of slithery reptilian performance that he kind of gives in Crash, where he's always kind of moving and undulating. He kind of does that in Some Kind of Wonderful. He's always protruding his chin and kind of using mannerisms. I mean, it's a one-note performance, but again, his character does evolve from this scumbag, essentially, that we see at the start of the film, to somebody who's having Eric Stoltz back. There's a scene later in the film that's wonderful in that regard. Obviously, I won't spoil it because you have to watch the film yourself, because it's such a classic. But it's just a wonderful performance by Koteas. Again, it took a little bit longer. He still had kind of uncredited roles, kind of bit parts. It wasn't until Atom Egoyan kind of had him in The Adjuster in 1991 He was also in Gardens of Stone with Mary Stuart Masterton, Coppola's wonderful Vietnam film with James Caan and James Earl Jones, one of my favourites. I recommend the Indicator release. But it's just a wonderful early performance by Cotis. You can kind of tell he's just like doing such a different thing to the rest of the cast. I mean, Masterton's really good as somebody who's obviously cares for Stoltz, and of course Stoltz just can't see it because he's like, Leah Thompson, Leah Thompson, Leah Thompson. But Cotius is just like so fascinating when he's on the screen. So it's not a great film, but it's a film I've always had a soft spot for, pretty much because the main characters are just so empty and just so borderline psychotic or sociopathic. And again, it's just this idea of that's the ideal and you have to go after that kind of woman. So then we have Bill Forsyth's wonderful Gregory's Girl from 1980, basically made for practically nothing, using non-professional actors. And again, I've always identified with Gregory because there's certain boys at school, myself included, who there's a fear of girls, there's a kind of lack of understanding, there's a kind of, they're a different race, they're a different species. But again, when Dee Hepburn's character comes in to school and wants to play in the football team, obviously it sends shockwaves, and we all think the film is about feminism and letting girls play football, whereas it's actually, again, just about this awkward period in certain boys' lives where, again, this idea of a girl, of a woman, a girl of your dreams, and also the reality is a little bit different. But it's just that awkwardness. You know, if you're watching this and you're a ladies' man and women just fall at your feet, obviously you're not really going to identify with Gregory or Eric Stoltz's character in some kind of wonderful. And again, it's just wonderfully told by Bill Forsyth. There's lovely comic touches about the two guys who want to go to Caracas because there's a 3-to-1 female to male ratio. The character who's in the penguin suit, the gym teacher who's trying to grow a moustache. There's just lots of lovely Bill Forsyth little touches. It's actually quite startling when you look up Bill Forsyth and realise he only directed 11 films. You know, he's still alive, but he's only directed 11 films, some of which are absolutely wonderful. Comfort and Joy, Local Hero, That Sinking Feeling, Housekeeping's really underrated, available in Indicator, and also Gregory's Girl, because for me, no filmmaker has ever perfectly encapsulated that awkwardness of teenage boys around girls when the hormones start kicking in, and that nervousness, that unknown about women or girls, in this schoolgirls in this case. The fact that, you know, there's the guy who's left school to be a window cleaner, and of course he tells the kids that are still there at school, oh yeah, he sees all these women undressing through the windows and they're all like desperate for afternoon freeze-ons, and of course the reality is obviously not anything like that, but that's just the kind of stories you heard when you were at school, and there'd be people who would always tell these stories of about, you know, getting lucky. You can argue whether that's actually lucky or unlucky. So it's just a wonderful portrayal of that period, But again, you're not going to respond to Gregory's girl or identify with Gregory in this idea that here's the perfect girl, but the girl that's actually sitting next to you is probably who cares about you and will always care about you more than this kind of fantasy idea of a woman. But it's just interesting seeing the down-to-earth Scottish. There's always a sense of melancholy with Scottish films, compared with that Hollywood American optimism, that you are going to find this amazing woman, you are going to have an amazing job, you know, your president loves you and God loves you. It's just two interesting little examples. Gregory's Girl from 1980 and Some Kind of Wonderful from 1987. Again, if you're an Elias Koteas fan, it's an essential watch because his performance is just wonderful in it, and John Ashton's fantastic, even though the film itself is a bit cheesy, but what's going on underneath I think is actually quite interesting. So thanks very much for watching this romantic double take, and hopefully you'll join me again for more double takes in the future. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films saying farewell.